Let's get some analysis on these changes. Dr. Richard Dennis joins us from our Canberra studio. He's the Executive Director of the influential think tank, the Australia Institute. Richard Dennis, thanks very much for talking to us. I notice you've called this Swan's Clayton's super reform. In other words, I guess you're saying this is the reform you have when you're not having a reform.
Oh, that's right. I mean, you know, the government set up a roundtable around 15 months ago. We've had speculation from the Prime Minister, from the Treasurer, from Bill Shorten about the need and in fact the opportunity to reform this. But, you know, to put it into perspective, we spend around $32 billion a year on tax concessions. It's projected to rise to $47 billion in the next couple of years. Today's announcements will collect about $250 million a year in revenue, less than 1%. So we've made some tiny reforms that affect 0.4% of the population, and unfortunately the superannuation system is not only creaking under the weight of these tax concessions, but it's incredibly inequitable because they go disproportionately to high income earners.
So you're saying even with these reforms, the tinkering around the edges, as you say, that the tax system will not be sustainable and equitable in the next year or two?
No, absolutely not. Look, over the next 10 years, the government's saying this will collect an extra $10 billion in revenue. That sounds like a lot. But over the next 10 years, the Australian taxpayer will put around $500 billion, that is $500 billion, into tax concessions for super. Tax concessions for super will cost us $500 billion in the coming decade, and today's announcement, you know, reflects around 1% of that. So this is small beer. It's shuffling deck chairs on the superannuation Titanic. We need much bigger changes to this, and today those who thought that superannuation reform might fund the Gonski or NDIS reforms, I think they'll be deeply disappointed.
Isn't it the case, though, the government's estimating that 16,000 of the highest earners will be affected? That's based on returns of around 5%. Let's assume then that that number would increase in obviously years of healthy investment returns. That would obviously mean more Australians have to pay.
That's right, and in years where there are negative returns, there'll be no money collected. So I think it's sensible to look at average returns, and yeah, some years a few more people will pay, some years no people will pay, but in a nutshell, in a population of 23 million people, this is a tiny change that affects a very small number of people. It certainly doesn't collect much revenue, and it does nothing to address the fact that Treasury tells us that the current arrangements ensure that the top 10% of income earners get more in these benefits than the bottom 60% combined. The top 10% get more than the bottom 60%, and today's announcements don't change that at all.
Are you happy with the detail that has been supplied and also the level of consultation? There have been some complaints, perhaps, regarding this particular move of taxing people who would be earning over $100,000, that there was no consultation.
No, I don't think there was consultation. I think clearly some people in industry have been consulted because they got what they've been asking for. I mean, you know, ironically today we've increased the voluntary contributions people can make to $35,000, but people earning the minimum wage of $32,000 or an average wage of $60,000, they've got no chance of putting $35,000 in. So there's clearly been some consultation with some powerful groups, but most Australians have been left out of this process. And as for the detail, well, there's no actual proposal to put this before Parliament, so there's not much detail at all.
All right, Richard Dennis, give us some numbers then. What, in your view, would make this system more sustainable and equitable?
Well, at the moment the system is actually backwards. We have a progressive income tax system in Australia that means the more you earn, the more tax you pay. But when it comes to superannuation, it's the opposite. The more you earn, the more we contribute. So a person who is a woman who's taken time out of the workforce to care for their children or care for an elderly parent will receive 0 precisely zero in tax concessions to help them fund their retirement. But if I earn $500,000 a year, I might get around $16,000 from the government as a contribution to my retirement income this year. So that is, in addition to the money I put in, the taxpayer is putting over $10,000 into my account. So what we need to do, I think, is go back to square one and say, well, if we're going to spend $45 billion a year helping fund people's retirements, whose retirements do we want to fund? Do we want to give a third of it to the wealthiest 5% and none of it to the bottom 10%, or do we want to flip that around? Do we want to put some money into the retirement savings of those with the least, and for those who've already accumulated $1 million or $2 million, why are we putting any taxpayers' money into their accounts at all?
And just briefly, I'll get you to comment too on one of the other changes, the increase in the cap on voluntary contributions from $25,000 to $35,000 for those aged 60 and over. Of course, the following year that'll drop to 50, those 50 and over.
Look, this is just about tax minimisation, not stimulating or encouraging savings. Again, a well-designed scheme would be offering incentives to young people to put money into super. But, you know, if you're already 50 or 55 or 60 when you're putting this money in, it's just shuffling investments you've already got from one tax environment into a lower tax environment. And again, this is irrelevant for people earning $50,000, $60,000 or $70,000 a year. Strangely, they don't have $35,000 to make a voluntary contribution with.
Dr. Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, thanks for your comments.
Thank you.